Hello guys, and welcome to the third video of this chapter. In this one, we'll be talking about 3D backgrounds, or rather 3D tools that help me create backgrounds. Here I've got a list of 3D tools that I've used as background support. To start with, actual Clip Studio Paint backgrounds. Not much I can add here that I haven't already mentioned earlier this course. You can download these from the asset store and use them as and with the character models. They're optimized for CSP and the best option if you want to manipulate a 3D environment inside the software. I haven't used these much though, so I can't vouch for the amount of detail they have or specificity of what you can find in the store. For the rest of the examples here, the way I've used them was by basically importing flat screenshots into CSP. The one that I've used the most is SketchUp, which isn't free, and within it models downloaded from the associated Trimble warehouse. I've downloaded a couple of models from Acorn3D, a website that sells extremely detailed background models, often created specifically for comics or webtoons. I know webtoon artists use it a lot, and it does seem great, but it's not exactly suited for my work and pipeline. I'm never entirely sure what backgrounds I'll be using often and are worth the investment, and I personally like to have my hand on drawing background lines, even if not entirely, so Acorn3D models have a bit too much detail for that to work. Blender 3D is an open source modeling and animating software that most of you might know. I've used it professionally and these days use it to open models I commission in OBJ format, for instance, and very little else. I would recommend it if you're interested in modeling your own objects or backgrounds from scratch, or even characters if you'd like. Again, to me it's mostly about opening files with it and taking screenshots to use in Clip Studio Paint, just as with SketchUp. Another one that's a very interesting one and actually a very easy one to use is Autodesk Tinkercad. You only need an account to use it, but it's free and very intuitive. I recommend having a look at it if you're interested in getting the main basic shapes of a space without detail so that you can add it later. For instance, if you want to have chairs and tables modeled by cubes and prisms and want to go in afterwards to add the detail yourself. It also comes with a few more funky shapes for building pieces and machinery, so it's also fun to play around with. Lastly, Room Styler. It's an interior design website with a Sims-like system and allows you to design rooms and add furniture from a huge range of options. Then place a camera in your scene and take rendered screenshots of it. I've used it to create a couple of rooms that I've used in the comic repeatedly. All this being said, how do I actually use 3D backgrounds? Generally, it's a mix between tracing screenshots and drawing things from scratch. If I do use the 3D import, it's because I've got a very specific man-made background in mind that I can't or don't want to just freestyle, or that I want to use more than once. Generally, the screenshot is an approximation of what I want, but not a colored or rendered product I want to use, so I'll always go in and draw over, then ditch the reference and add my own take to it. This is definitely more time consuming than just using the actual render or screenshot, but it helps me get a better grip on my art style and be less dependent on specific models or software for my work. One of the ways that I go about this is starting by getting the lines with the artistic filter I mentioned earlier. I would normally still go in and change them a bit most times, but for the sake of simplicity I'll leave it raw here. Then I'll take my reference, which is normally a reference for either just lighting or color in general, and color pick what I want from there. I normally lower the opacity of the lines at this stage, but I forgot that step here, so the lines here are very black and blocky. After this, I'd merge everything and work on effects and additional painting over the lines. Effects follows similar lines to the character blending process with a mix of multiply, overlay, and add glow layers together with some blurs. I'll leave a note on the blurs for the next video. In here, I airbrushed some shadows on multiply and some highlights with an add glow layer, as well as some saturation on overlay. The way I see most people use 3D models on Webtoon, though, seems to be directly with the renders or screenshots. I've done a poor attempt at exemplifying it here since it's a technique that I'm not familiar or comfortable with. It seems to save a lot of time if your style works with it and you find the assets you need available, so I'd recommend looking at webtoons where artists use this technique to see if it's something you're interested in reproducing. Unfortunately, I don't know of any tutorial on this, so the way I'd go about it is just interpreting the base render or flat colored asset as a character and shade it as such. This gets tricky when 3D models already have their own shadows even if they're not rendered, but it's not wholly impossible. Personally, just not my cup of tea. Other than these techniques, sometimes I'll take the lines from the background and color it with pure flat colors before adding lighting and adjustments. I think this step is important if you have something like a specific room whose base colors remain constant throughout different times of the day, year, etc., and are subjected to different forms of lighting. Whether or not I think a background benefits from a two-step coloring process depends on how often I predict I'll use it, and how well the references match not only the lighting I'm aiming for, but the colors too. The good thing about all of these is that despite being more time consuming than just sketching a quick background or blurring everything, once you have one of these backgrounds created, you can copy and reuse it or parts of it easily throughout a comic or a scene. Again, as an attachment to this video, I will now be playing the rest of the process for that drawing that I've been creating. Which means now we're gonna see the background part where I take a 3D background, I take the lines from it, and I use a reference to color it in. So now we're getting into the part of the background. For that, the first thing I do is go to the rasterized background layer, go to filter, artistic, to get the lines as I explained in this video. I press OK, and then I get just the lines, no opacity. One thing that I decided to do first though was to duplicate the background layer because I might want to use the flats that it already had. As a matter of fact, this Clip Studio asset does have rendered colors, and it has really good coloring, so the logical thing to do here would actually be to preserve the base colors. However, for the sake of demonstrating how I would use just the lines on the background and the reference picture, I got rid of them. And now I am color picking from my reference there, so that's the light reference that I'm going to use. It's the only reason it's there. I randomly decided that I wanted that type of lighting, and so I'll be color picking certain parts of it and trying to translate the color picked areas to my background that isn't really, that close to the background in the original picture. So in here I tried to use a symmetry ruler to paint the details, but the picture isn't exactly symmetrical, so eventually I just gave up on it. I tried to keep each separate color or each separate object on a separate layer in case I want to change them later, but eventually I will merge everything down. This part is sped up by twice the speed, so not 4 times, just twice, so you can see how little detail I add to backgrounds. So based on the original line work, I don't really fill in things that carefully, I'm sort of in a rush, I don't want to spend too much time thinking about it. And the point of this is also to show you that when it comes to backgrounds, it's okay to, slack in some ways if you don't have the time or patience to fill them in. My trick to sort of know which colors should go where is to essentially take them from the reference. So if the reference has a thing that looks like a ceiling, maybe that's the color I'm gonna use for my ceiling. If it has a thing that looks like walls with windows, that's the color that's gonna go onto the walls and windows. If it has a little bit of floor or, floor tiles or anything, that's what I'm gonna be using. And other than that, if it has a lighter tone and I have a lighter element on my scene, like that board over there for instance, then that's where I'm going to pick it from. The advantage of doing this is when you already have a picture with a set lighting that's reflected on certain types of object, you already have a palette of objects that work with that lighting. You don't have to think about, you know, whether they clash too much, because any color that I'm going to pick from this picture is probably going to work with the sort of environment that I'm going for. Now, this whole process is a bit of a trial and error thing as well. I'm never 100% sure it's gonna work until I see the final result. And a lot of the time I just end up blurring everything because, you know, I don't really know where to add more detail or to remove more detail. But the trick here is to sort of trust the process. Again, if you're picking from that picture, the colors will make sense. There's always gonna be adjustments you can make to make it better. Adjustments are like what I'm doing right now. So I've added a multiply layer, which is a shadow layer, and I'm airbrushing sort of like the areas that I want darker. And after that, I'm going to be, you know, highlighting the areas that I want with light with a add glow layer. So now I'm going out to the windows, like in my reference, and then I'm going to just add some like bright blue highlight behind. That's the vibe I was going for. Eventually, I will merge all the flats and then merge all the adjustments as well. So now I'm working on a single layer. And on that layer, if I have the patience, I will add proper details. Otherwise, I'll just start blurring things. Right here, I'm doing a little bit of a mix of both. So I blurred the far back to start with, just to see how it would look. And now I'm using a watercolor brush to blend some colors. I'm gonna use my hard brush to add some highlights. You'll see on the bench, for instance, on the metal thing. If I wanted to go more into detail, I could also add some details on the shadows, you know, some black areas or darker areas. Probably not pure black, but it's basically adding detail on the parts that I know will be less blurred. So sort of like the middle ground, you know. All of this process is done by having a shortcut to color pick, and I'm color picking as I go. You know, if I want to replicate a color or come closer to that color, I'm just picking the colors around it and stroking. Like, it's basically one color pick per stroke. This is why it's extremely useful to have a shortcut for color picking. The tablet that I use and the pen that I use has a couple of buttons in it, and one of the buttons instantly picks a color. So that's extremely efficient. You know, if I was rendering more, I don't do a lot of rendering, but if I did, this would be a major time saver. Cool, and after a while I'm sort of satisfied. I lock the layer so that I can blur its edges without them actually looking blurred, and I'm gonna add some blur. I add more blur in the far distance, obviously, but I also add some blur in the front because I don't want attention taken from the character. I add some more adjustment layers. The advantage of adjustment layers is that if you have a strong light source, you can just add a glow layer and it will basically blend your background together. You don't have to think about it too much. And that's it for the video, for the process. This was a very sort of impromptu, you know, it was very improvised type of drawing. I just wanted to show you in general how I'd go about doing a background, blending a character in. You know, in the end I'd probably add more effects to this. I'd add more shadows and lights to the background, add some more details, but for all intended purposes this is the full process. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you took something from it. Next video is just going to be a nod to Gaussian blur. We'll be talking about using it in both backgrounds and drawings in general. See you then!